The Shadow of the Past. Chapter 1. The Castle Awaits. Eldritch sat in the dimly lit carriage, the rhythmic clatter of hooves against the cold stone path, echoing through the silent night. The air was thick, damp, and carried the scent of deep earth and decay. The driver said nothing as they rode through the winding mountain pass, where jagged peaks rose like the fangs of a slumbering beast. The road twisted and turned, the forest lining it, stretching like skeletal fingers towards the sky. Then, as they cleared the final bend, it came into view. A castle, ancient and foreboding, its spires clawing at the heavens. The windows were dark, like empty sockets in the skull of some long-dead titan. A crimson glow pulsed faintly within the stone walls, subtle yet undeniable. Eldritch felt something deep within his bones. This place. It was too familiar, too much like the stories he once read, too much like a story he had lived. The driver abruptly pulled the carriage to a halt. His hands trembled as he gripped the reins, his eyes fixed ahead. "This is as far as I go," the man muttered, his voice hoarse, betraying a fear he dared not speak. Without another word, he threw Eldritch's case onto the frozen dirt and snapped the reins. The horses bolted into the night, the carriage vanishing down the pass, leaving only a whisper of hoofbeats in the distance. Eldritch exhaled, his breath a mist in the frigid air. Alone now, he picked up his case and turned toward the looming castle. There was only one thing it could mean. Eldritch clenched his fists. He must destroy what he once was. But how does a man slay his own past when he no longer has the power to stand against it? Eldritch stepped into the grand hall of the castle, its silence a crushing weight upon his shoulders. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling in the dim shafts of light that filtered through the cracked and broken stained glass windows. Cobwebs stretched across the vast ceilings, draping over crumbling chandeliers that once shone with opulence. The once polished floors bore the scars of time, splintered and warped, their grandeur reduced to decay. The castle was dead. His footsteps echoed hollowly through the empty corridors as he wandered its vast abandoned halls. This place had not seen life in centuries, but it had seen death. Eldritch ran his fingers along the ruined tapestries, the faded sigils of long-forgotten houses barely visible beneath the dust. He knew why he was here. He had to find the elder that ruled this castle. He had to destroy it. Yet there was nothing. No signs of movement. No lurking presence. Only the crumbling ruin of a once mighty domain. Outside, the sun began to dip beneath the horizon. The castle seemed to shudder with the changing light, as if waking from its slumber. The long shadows stretched and deepened, devouring the halls inch by inch. Eldritch felt it. The shift. The air grew colder, the silence more alive. Something was coming. He entered a vast dining hall, its former grandeur long since lost to time. A massive table stretched before him, its surface coated in dust, the wooden chairs splintered and broken. Cobwebs clung to the ceiling, swaying gently in the unseen draughts that whispered through the crumbling stone. Then he saw him. At the head of the ruined table, seated like a king upon his throne of rot, was a man, old, dressed in black, watching. Eldritch hesitated, but then strode forward, his pulse steady, his mind sharp. He had come too far to falter now. The man's voice broke the silence, smooth yet weathered, his tone carrying a knowing amusement. "Do not worry, Eldritch. I am not your fight. That will come soon enough." Eldritch stopped a few feet away, watching the old man carefully. There was no fear in his posture, no hostility, only curiosity. "But I must admit," the man continued, his pale fingers tracing the cracks in the wooden table, "I am puzzled, not by your presence. You were always meant to come, but by your intent. Tell me, how do you intend to win this trial?" His gaze sharpened. "A single elder could end you in a mere second. You have no powers, no strength, nothing that could possibly stand against them. And yet, you come willingly into this castle of death, where its inhabitants, each of them powerful elders, await you. And you are just a weak man. Eldritch allowed a small, knowing smile to touch his lips. He met the old man's gaze, unwavering. Weak? A man, yes. He stepped closer, the firelight from the half-dead sconces casting long shadows across his face. But you forget something. The man in black raised a brow. And what is that? Eldritch leaned in slightly, his voice steady, calm. Somehow, I have lived longer than all of those who dwell here. A slow smile spread across the old man's lips. A deep, amused chuckle escaped him. Indeed, he murmured. I bid you well, Eldritch. And then he was gone, a whisper of air, a shifting of shadows, and then movement. Eldritch turned sharply. Somewhere in the dark, they had awoken. Eldritch's mind worked swiftly. He needed weapons. He may have been weak, powerless, and alone, but he had one advantage. He used to be one of them. He knew how they thought. He knew their tricks, their powers, their weaknesses. He retraced his steps through the crumbling corridors, moving with calculated purpose. The vast, ruined castle was a mausoleum of the past, its silence thick with anticipation. They were awake now. They were coming. He passed through a grand hall. The floor was nothing but dust. That was useful. Anything that moved would leave a trail. Eldritch's eyes darted across the space. There, shattered wood from an old support beam. He strode over and picked up a jagged length of it, sharp, sturdy. A stake. He gripped it tightly, then knelt. One weapon would not be enough. Taking another shard, he buried it beneath the dust, angled upward. A trap. If he was going to die, he would make them work for it. His next step was bait. Reaching down, he tore a strip of cloth from his already worn sleeve. Then, with a wince, he cut into his palm. The pain was sharp but familiar. He squeezed his fist, letting warm, fresh blood soak into the fabric. A hungry elder would be drawn to the scent. Distracted, he placed the bloody cloth a few paces away, near the hidden stake. A lure. Now he was ready. Eldritch took a deep breath, his grip tightening around his weapon. He knew how this would go. There would not be one. There would be 3, maybe 4. A place as dead as this could not sustain any more. And now they were awake. The silence stretched. The air grew colder. And then, a whisper, a flicker of movement in the dark. They were here. The first one appeared. Eldritch tightened his grip on the stake. His body was ready, but his mind knew the truth. Then another, and another, and another. Hundreds. They stepped out of the shadows, their figures tall and gaunt, their eyes glowing like coals in the abyss. They filled the vast hall, standing shoulder to shoulder, a sea of death. Nocturna had sent them all. This was no test of strength. This was an execution. The elders sneered, their lips curling over razor teeth, their laughter crawling across the stone walls. One stepped forward. A woman, once beautiful, now nothing but hunger, wrapped in a mockery of flesh. "Eldritch," she whispered, "the traitor of his kind." The laughter around him swelled. "You come to die." Eldritch collapsed to his knees. This was truly impossible. He had been prepared to die against 3, but 100. He had no chance. The weight of futility crashed over him. The stake fell from his grasp. The old man from before stepped out from behind the crowd. He walked calmly, hands clasped behind his back, smiling with quiet satisfaction. "Did you truly think this would be like any other trial?" Eldritch remained still, his head lowered, his hands slack. "You cannot pass this trial, Eldritch," the old man continued. "You will be my champion after all." His voice was smooth, unhurried, as if he had already won, because he had. "Nothing can save you. Only your loyalty to me. Swear it now, and this will be over quickly." The other elders chuckled, their hunger unrelenting. "Fight, and I'll make sure you go slowly, painfully, and you'll still be my champion." Eldritch had shut down. His mind had given up. He was lost. He had no thoughts, no plans, only instinct, a primitive, resigned instinct to face the inevitable end. And then, a thought, a single thought, a memory, distant but clear, Winter's lab. Winter, speaking in his relentless way, pacing, moving too fast for Eldritch to keep up, filling the room with words. "Eldritch, do you know why sunlight destroys elders?" Eldritch had barely listened at the time. Winter had gone on about the infrared spectrum, about the science of light penetration, how it bypassed the regenerative properties of an elder's body and reached the shadow itself, the thing that kept them alive beyond death. Winter had spoken for hours, too much, too technical, too detailed. Eldritch hadn't absorbed it all, but he remembered one thing: infrared. Red! His eyes flicked open. The elders around him laughed. They had already won. The old man smirked. But Eldritch's gaze wasn't on them. It was on the crimson glow in the room, the red glow that had been there since he arrived, the faint, eerie red light that pulsed within the castle's stone walls, its ancient banners, its dust-covered chandeliers. Crimson light. Eldritch had assumed it was Nocturna's influence, but what if it wasn't? What if Nocturna had no control over it at all? A spark ignited in his mind, a single desperate gamble. His fingers curled into fists. He had been wrong before. This wasn't impossible. And he wasn't going to die here. He had the answer. Eldritch stood, his fingers closed around the wooden stake as he rose to his feet. The laughter of the elders echoed through the chamber, but it no longer touched him. Something inside him had shifted. Confidence. Hope. He said nothing. He did not need to. Instead, he walked forward, straight toward them. For the first time, they took a step back. Some sneered, amused by his foolishness. Others simply watched, but all of them felt it. Something had changed. Eldritch wasn't playing their game anymore. He was playing his own. No weapons? That wasn't true. He had one. A trump card he had been carrying all along. His crimson deer, his own, was dull, its power locked, until he completed the trial. But the one from Victor Halloway's mansion... Eldritch slipped his hand into his pocket. His fingers closed around the smooth surface of the second crimson tear. He lifted it high. It shone bright. Crimson. Red. A sharp, unearthly glow flooded the chamber. The elders recoiled. A scream rang out. The red light burned through the shadows. Some of the vampires collapsed where they stood, disintegrating into nothing. Others fled, vanishing into the darkness, escaping the crimson inferno. Eldritch knew. He had known the moment he pieced it together. The trials must be balanced. Nocturna had stacked the deck against him. But this was still a game, and games had rules. This was his move. He held the crimson tear high, basking in the searing light, his lips curling into a grim smile. "Thank you, Simon," he whispered. The last few elders vanished into the shadows, leaving only one figure standing, the old man, unmoved, unaffected. And then slowly he lifted his head. His face shifted. The illusion melted away. Nocturna. His black eyes burned with rage, but he did not move. He could not. He could not upset the balance of the trial. Eldritch saw it in his face. He saw the frustration, the desire to tear the game apart, but he couldn't, and Eldritch almost wished he would. Because if Nocturna interfered, winter would come. The castle lay in ruin, its halls filled with the distant echoes of the dead. The once proud fortress of the night had become nothing more than a tomb. The air was thick with dust and the lingering scent of ancient decay. But something else filled the stone corridors now. Fear. For the first time in centuries, they were afraid. Eldritch stepped forward, his boots crushing the brittle bones of time-forgotten prey. In his hand, the crimson tear burned like a captured sun, its light slicing through the suffocating darkness. The castle walls trembled with the terrified whispers of its inhabitants. The elders had known no fear for centuries, until now. A rustling, barely audible, came from the rafters above. Eldritch didn't look up. Instead, he raised the crimson tear, tilting it slightly so that its glow reached the high beams. Instantly, a piercing shriek split the silence. A figure, shriveled and grotesque, tumbled from the ceiling, its flesh peeling away in ribbons as it fell. It hit the ground, writhing in agony, its hollowed-out eye sockets melting into black ichor. Eldritch stepped forward and drove his boot down on the creature's throat. The scream stopped. From the darkened corridors, shadows scattered like rats. The great lords of the night, who had once ruled in absolute power, were running. They had fed upon generations of mortals, ripping them from their homes, draining them without hesitation. And now they knew what it meant to be hunted. Eldritch followed without mercy. A flicker of movement ahead, a door left slightly ajar. He moved swiftly, forcing it open. Inside, a woman clad in ornate robes, her skin like withered parchment, gasped as the red glow illuminated her. She hissed and recoiled, crawling backward like an insect. Eldritch threw the crimson tear into the room. The light exploded outward, and she screamed as her skin blistered and peeled. She tried to shield herself, but it was too late. Her body disintegrated into dust, her bones cracking apart as they collapsed to the floor. He picked up the crimson tear and moved on. He found them in the walls, behind crumbling bookcases, locked in iron coffins. A tall, skeletal elder attempted to flee through a hidden passage, but Eldritch was faster. He slammed the stone door shut and held the crimson tear close to the cracks. The vampire howled from the other side, his voice rising to an agonized pitch before fading into nothing. Another tried to bury himself beneath the floorboards. Eldritch pried up the wood with his bare hands and shoved the light into the hole. A pair of clawed hands rose, reaching desperately, before turning to dust. In one of the grander chambers, a cluster of lesser elders had gathered in a circle, whispering incantations. Eldritch kicked in the door. Elders, hissing, scrambling. "No! Stop him!" One lunged, but Eldritch had already raised the tear. The glow poured into the room like a flood of fire. The elders screamed, their voices merging into a single unholy shriek. Their robes disintegrated as their flesh peeled from their bones, their eyes sinking into empty sockets before they collapsed into the dust of ages. Silence. Eldritch stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, his grip tightening on the tear. There was one left, deep in the castle's crypt, behind a massive iron gate. The final coffin waited. Eldritch knew whose it was. He had sensed it from the moment he arrived. The head of the castle, the one who had ruled over this place for centuries. He walked forward. The coffin was ornate, decorated with gold filigree and ancient symbols long forgotten by mankind. The lid was slightly open. A trap. He reached forward slowly. A whisper of movement. The lid exploded upward, a pair of ghoulishly long arms shooting out from within. A clawed hand grasped at Eldritch's throat. Fast, inhumanly strong, Eldritch drove the stake into the creature's chest. The elder screamed, clawing at him, trying to push him away, but Eldritch held firm, twisting the stake deeper and deeper, driving it through the ribcage. The elder thrashed violently, knocking over ancient urns and candelabras, his face contorted in agony, black blood spilling from his lips. Eldritch did not stop. He kept pushing. The elder groaned in pain, then in rage, then in fear. Then he stopped. His body slumped, the black ichor still oozing from the wound. The elder shuddered one last time before his entire form withered into ash. Eldritch stood in the main hall of the castle. He was breathing hard, his hands shaking. His entire body was splattered in black blood, his face smeared with the remnants of his hunt. The crimson tear in his hand flickered weakly. A voice. Nocturna. My. Eldritch. Eldritch slowly turned. In the grand throne at the far end of the hall, Nocturna sat, smiling. His dark eyes gleamed with amusement. Nocturna, grinning. "I had hoped you would pass this little trial of mine. And look at you." He gestures at the black blood smeared across Eldritch's face. "I see one of my dear elders put up a fight." Eldritch doesn't respond. His expression is unreadable. Something is wrong. He feels sick. Nocturna's smile widens. "And now, my champion, it is time for the real fight to begin." The castle was silent. Not the kind of silence that came from peace, but the kind left behind after violence, after annihilation. Eldritch stood in the grand hall, the weight of his hunt crushing down upon him. His vision blurred, his breath ragged. Something was wrong. His body ached, his stomach twisted in ways it never had before. His hands trembled, his legs felt weak beneath him. He staggered slightly, gripping one of the ancient stone pillars to steady himself. His fingers smeared the surface black. The elder's blood, thick and tar-like, clung to his skin like a stain that could never be washed away. It covered him, his face, his clothes, his very being tainted with it. From the shadows of the grand hall, a voice echoed, smooth, amused, triumphant. Nocturna. My. Eldritch. Eldritch forced his head up. At the far end of the chamber, seated upon an ornate throne, Nocturna reclined lazily, his fingers steepled together, his dark eyes gleaming with a sinister light. He smirked, observing Eldritch's battered state, the black blood, the weakened stance, the visible exhaustion. Nocturna, you look unwell. Eldritch didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was dry, his stomach burned, his entire body felt foreign. He had taken hundreds of lives before, yet never had he felt like this after. Never this sick. But Nocturna, unaware of the true cause, misread his suffering. He leaned forward, his smirk deepening. I must say, I had wondered if you could do it, if you could really bring yourself to kill your own kind. He paused, tilting his head slightly. Well, former kind. Eldritch's jaw tightened. He had expected mockery, expected Nocturna to revel in the carnage he had been forced to unleash. But Nocturna wasn't just pleased, he was proud. To think, the infamous Eldritch, the hunted, has become the hunter, and quite the merciless one at that. I felt their fear, you know, their despair, how they ran, how they begged. You didn't just kill them, Eldritch. He leaned back, smiling. You broke them. Eldritch's fingers curled into fists. He could still feel the last one struggling beneath his grasp, the stake in his hand sinking deeper and deeper. He had never enjoyed killing. Never. And yet, standing there now, covered in their blood, with a sickness gnawing at his insides, he felt as though something inside him had shifted. Nocturna's eyes flicked to the black stain smeared across Eldritch's face. His smirk curled into something more sinister. Ah, I see one of my dear elders put up a fight. Eldritch remained silent, unmoving. The truth, the real reason for his suffering, sat just beneath his ribs, burning in his veins. But Nocturna did not know. Nocturna only saw the aftermath, the shaking hands, the sickly stance, the blood that had marked Eldritch as one of his own. And Nocturna laughed. How poetic! You, a mere man, carving through the immortals like a blade through flesh. What a sight it must have been. How I would have loved to watch. Eldritch forced himself to stand straighter. His muscles screamed, his body threatened to collapse, but he would not let Nocturna see it. Nocturna's laughter faded, but his smile remained. The real trial is just beginning, my champion. He leaned forward, voice dripping with anticipation. You see, you may have cleansed the castle, but there is one who has been waiting for you, one who wants nothing more than to see you break. Eldritch's breath shallowed. He already knew. Nocturna's smile widened, as if tasting the very thought on Eldritch's mind. Ah, yes, you know exactly who I speak of. Your greatest failure, your unfinished fight, the one who still clings to rage beyond the grave. Nocturna stood, his form shifting slightly in the dim candlelight. He gestured with a lazy flick of his wrist. And now, my champion, he chuckled, it is time for you to face him once more. The crimson tear in Eldritch's pocket flared to life. The world around him blurred, a sudden pull, a rush of crimson light, and then darkness. The air was heavy, oppressive. Eldritch's boots met solid stone, the sound echoing through an empty, vast arena. The place was colossal, its high walls etched with the marks of countless battles. The smell of old blood clung to the air like a ghost. Eldritch staggered, his vision swimming. The sickness inside him still churned, but he ignored it, because ahead of him, standing motionless in the centre of the arena, was a man. No, not a man, a monster. His back was turned, but Eldritch could already feel the hatred radiating from him, the sheer weight of rage. The figure twitched, then turned slowly. A familiar face, a face twisted by madness. Duncan MacDrustan. His lips curled, baring teeth that had tasted the destruction of countless lives. His body, massive and monstrous, trembled with barely restrained fury. But his eyes, His eyes were where the true nightmare lay. They burned with something that wasn't human, something that had been left to fester in the abyss for far too long. Nocturna's voice echoed from the unseen heavens, a whispered promise of carnage. "One-on-one, Eldritch. No weapons, no tricks, no shadows to hide behind," he chuckled. "You will not win." Eldritch's jaw tightened. Duncan took a single step forward, the stone beneath him cracking under the sheer weight of his presence. Then he charged.